Good morning, Broadway. We welcome you in Jesus' name to worship this morning. We are so glad you are here, whether you are in person with us or live on our live stream. Just a couple of quick notes. You might notice some different faces up here. Well, mine has been the same, but Aaron is out this week, enjoying a little bit of a vacation, and Scott Gibbons is our guest preacher. Also, to that note, we have changed a little bit of the order of worship. Don't worry, it's okay. It's on purpose. It wasn't a mistake. It have been, but it wasn't on purpose. Mistake. Anyway, a few announcements before we get started or continue in worship. Our Community Meal and Connection Summer Series kicks off next Sunday, the 30th at 11:15 in Backstage at Broadway, which I guess is where? Down? Over? Down? Down there. Thank you. It is The Music in Me. So come with a link or a recording of your favorite song or one of your favorite songs, and be prepared to share why it's your favorite song. We will provide a taco bar. So if you can provide, if you'd like or are able, a pitch-in. Also, where I'm from, we call those potlucks, not pitch-ins. So this has been a new cultural thing to learn, pitch-ins. But you don't have to, not required. All we want is you. And next Tuesday, I am teaching a class starting at 6:30. The author of the book, Reverend Dr. Lacey Warner, who is my Methodism and polity professor at Duke, will join us. And in light of General Conference and all of these changes, you might be like, what does it even mean to be United Methodist? And we're going to talk about that. If that sounds interesting to you, or even if it doesn't and you want to humor me, please join us in the parlor or on Zoom. I will send out, or someone will send out a link on Tuesday as a reminder. You don't have to stay every week. You can pop in and pop out, but I hope it will be a good time of fellowship and some edification about what it means to be United Methodist in this new space. So let's prepare our hearts and minds as we continue in worship. Now, will you please join me in a responsive call to worship? Your responses are in bold in the bulletin and on the screen. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed. And those who know your name have put their trust in you. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble. God made the storm be still, and the waves of the seas were hushed. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Amen. Now will you please rise in body or in spirit as you're able for our first hymn, My Hope is Built, number 368 in the red hymnal.
Please remain standing for the gospel reading. It's from Mark 4, chapter 4, beginning with the 35th verse. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Holy words, holy wisdom.
You may be seated. So as Emilee said, we broke things up a little bit. We were trying something a little new, especially the lectionary passages this week had a similar theme, but different stories, different nuances, like looking at it from a couple different perspectives. So that's kind of why we did that, but hopefully it will illuminate a lot of where we're going and where I think the Spirit's leading us this morning. But first, let's start with this passage in Mark. Let's take kind of a little step backwards and look at the setting. I mean, we got kind of the characters, but just a bigger overview with the book of Mark. When you look at the setting, keep in mind that there's a bigger purpose to the book of Mark, right? Like most authors, when they write something, they've got a big theme that they go through. And Mark's big theme is to answer the question, who is Jesus? It starts in the beginning of the book, and it goes on throughout. It's asked multiple times. It was asked in this passage here, and then finally kind of answered near the conclusion of the book. And so let's jump in from there. So remembering, hold that in, that the book of Mark is all about who is Jesus. And you jump into the particular setting of the story. Jesus has just done a bunch of different miracles. And as all humans, he's possibly tired, needs a little bit of a break, a rest. And so he says to his disciples, let's go across the sea. We're going to cross the Sea of Galilee to the other side. Now, there's not a lot of, we don't know why he said to take across the sea as opposed to walk around. Most people think it's probably because he didn't want the crowd that was there to follow him. Again, he needs a break, right? It's kind of like when you, as a parent, go to your room and you shut the door because you need a break from the kids, right? You can't just sit and expect there to be a break. You kind of need to have that little barrier. So they take off, and think about the disciples. We know who they are, and there are at least 3 of them that are fishermen. That's very important to this context. So there are 3 that are skilled, have experience, training, all of that into the life of the sea, right? Simon, who will be called Peter, James, and John. Specifically, that's their livelihood, that's their life. So Jesus and the disciples get on the boat, and they start moving across the Sea of Galilee. Like, we don't get the details of who's running what on the ship, who's doing what, but again, for all intents and purposes, we can assume Peter, James, and John are probably heavily involved in making sure the ship's going to go where it needs to go. Jesus isn't a sailor, right? Like, that's not part of who he is. But there are some of his disciples that have that experience, and Jesus is aware of that. And so you can see in this passage Jesus' full trust of them when he takes a pillow and goes to the front of the boat to fall asleep, to get a little bit of rest, to take a nap, right? They would have had to learn how to read the wind and the weather and all of the different things that have to do with the sea, right? That's part of their livelihood. That's part of their existence. That's how they survive. And the interesting thing is that the Sea of Galilee isn't actually that big. When I was looking it up and trying to get some comparisons, some ideas about it, like, it's not even as big as Lake Michigan. It's a decent sized sea, and it's, some people go back and forth about whether it should be called a sea or whether it should just be called a big lake. Because again, Lake Michigan's bigger than it. But it is still fairly significant. It's a fairly significant size, so still would be able to have a storm that could be somewhat terrifying. And the disciples would have been used to that kind of thing. They would have been used to, again, reading the winds, reading the sea, seeing what's coming up. But the author of Mark describes the sea storm or the squall that pops up as serious. Uses the term serious. Now, there's not a lot of understanding of what is meant by serious. Like, again, we're not going to get the weather report like we get today. And especially because it wasn't written originally in English, right? So just the word serious is what they use to translate it. But the author does continue to describe a little bit of what they meant by the word serious when they say that the waves were breaking over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. So that means the waves are coming in on the sides. And again, we can assume Jesus is up front away from those. I don't know if anybody's ever done one of those log water rides at like an amusement park, right? And you splash at the bottom. And a funny family story where like we were getting in, we were about to go, like one of the first times we did it all as a family. And I'm like, if we sit in the front, usually the front people get the least wet, right? Because the splash goes backwards, which was not the case. We got drenched. But typically that is the case, that right? Like the people in the front because the waves go back. And so we can assume maybe that's what's happening, right? These waves are going in. But we also know that it's such a serious storm that these seasoned fishermen are nervous. They're worried. They're not sure what's going on. The storm was probably a bit more than these fishermen were either prepared for or capable of handling. Especially when you think about fishermen of this time and how the boats would have been. They probably wouldn't have navigated a storm like this. If they saw something like this, especially if the waves are coming over the side, that means it's washing the fish back into the sea, right? Like, that is not a smart idea if you're a fisherman. And so this might have been something, and especially with probably the speed that it came on, they're looking a little worried. The funny thing about it to me is that you think about the other disciples on the ship that aren't fishermen, and they're looking at Peter, James, and John and going, wait a second, they seem worried, and they're supposed to know what they're doing. I have no idea what I'm doing, and if they're afraid, I should probably be afraid as well, right? I mean, you can start to see that play out. But a key piece that we miss in all of this a lot of times is not just Jesus and his understanding of all of creation and what's going on with it, but Jesus' trust of the disciples, right? They get on the boat, they're starting to head out to sea. He is not a seaman at all. He is not a sailor. He probably had been on a boat before. I mean, we have examples of it, right? Don't know how far he's traveled, all those kinds of things. But we do know that he stepped onto the ship fully trusting his disciples to take care of it. You can almost imagine him laying there more asleep than awake because of the storm starting to go, right? Like it's kind of roused him just enough. Like, have you ever had a situation like that, maybe even this morning, where you can start to hear the thunder a little bit? And you're like, it's just enough to get you up, but not enough to get you fully awake and to do something about it, right? I mean, I think about it as well as a parent. Like, you hear your kids doing something or something's going on, and you're like, is this enough that I should go handle it, or can I go back to sleep, right? You might be taking an afternoon snooze or fell asleep on the couch, right? And it kind of seems like that's where Jesus is at. He's asleep, and he's kind of aware probably of what's going on, but not enough to get up and do something about it. And I love the scholar Norma D. Hooker points out something interesting in that Jesus trusted them enough to not get up. Like, obviously the storm is enough that the boat's moving, but Jesus doesn't get up. He's still trusting his disciples that they're going to handle it, and almost saying, if it's that big of an issue, if it's going to be that big of a problem, they'll say something to me, right? Same as, again, like parents with children. If it's that big of a whatever, they're going to come say something to me about it. And so you can see Jesus having this great trust in them. But then it does get serious enough. It does progress to the point where the disciples start to go, maybe we should wake Jesus up with this one. Like, maybe this is getting serious. So they do. But the author uses an interesting dialogue to describe them waking him up. And again, I think about it as a parent in the context of my kids waking me up like this. Because the author relates that the disciples wake Jesus up and immediately go, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Like, you can almost like picture with children, right? Like, you're kind of doing your own thing, and they start bickering a little bit or something, and then they come to you and they're like, "Dad, don't you care that we're fighting?" Right? Like, you should have done something about this. Like, they're making a judgment call about how Jesus should be handling the situation. When Jesus is, I trusted you guys to get us across to the other side of the sea. So it's kind of this interesting interchange. Almost as if they would have assumed that, number one, he's aware of the storm, as if he wasn't, and that he would have known how bad it actually was. Again, Jesus didn't grow up on the sea the same way that Peter, James, and John did. The author, again, Norman D. Hooker, seems to chalk this up to Jesus' trust in his disciples, that he trusted that they would be able to handle it. I mean, the disciples don't wake him up to discuss the situation, right? They don't wake him up and say, Jesus, this is where we're at. What do you think we should do? They immediately wake him up to fix the situation. As I would put it, they wake him up to alleviate their fear. They are so afraid that I don't care what it is. I don't want to talk about it. Jesus, you take care of it. This is beyond me, right? Jesus does immediately get up. And he simply speaks to the storm, and it just goes away. It just immediately calms down, right? Which does demonstrate Jesus' complete control over the chaos of nature that they're experiencing, which would have been a big deal to them, right? Like, to them, they've navigated these things before, but like this, oh no, it's just taken care of. It's just gone. But as Jesus points out in his response to his disciples, they didn't have faith in God to protect them through it, or not to mention their fellow disciples, trusting in Peter, James, and John that they could sail through it all. But I don't want to hammer on the disciples a little too much. I mean, we've all been in situations where fear overtook us, right? Where we became so afraid of a situation that we didn't know our way out of it. That where the fear that we had was such a big feeling. I mean, I'm using teacher language there, like we got big feelings, right? Big feelings that overcome our ability to see anything beyond what's right in front of us, the thing that's causing that fear and the danger that might be posed by it. But they're starting to think through and being overwhelmed by that fear, thinking through all the worst case scenarios, all the worst possibilities, right? As I mentioned in the email this week, this is exactly the point of the new Disney Pixar movie, Inside Out 2. Go see it if you haven't already. And I promise, other than like just mentioning it, no spoilers at all. But I do think that these movies, Inside Out 2, give a perfect picture of how we function, especially in situations like the disciples find themselves in. The first movie did this great job of showing how emotions can take over us, how they can become pretty much all that we are preoccupied with. Start to make us think differently about the situation because of that. Think differently, possibly even act differently than we normally would had we not had those overwhelming big feelings. But Jesus, in the midst of it, slightly aroused probably by the storm going on, but then fully woken up by his disciples, addresses the situation. And he shows them that you can have feelings, but that those feelings may not be telling you the whole story, may not be showing the whole reality that you're experiencing. They're just a part of it. There's always a bigger picture or a bigger story going on. Typically, and emphasize, typically, it is in spite of what we're feeling about the situation. This is how I understand what Jesus says to his disciples after the storm. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? This is how I understand it. It's almost like he's saying, do you not realize that one, who I am, as God incarnate, right? You've seen me do all of these great things. Disciples, you don't understand who I am, but you also don't understand there's a bigger story here that not only am I involved in, but that you are also involved in. That you don't need to be afraid because our story doesn't stop here. And so it's almost like Jesus is saying you're missing this bigger picture and you're just stuck in the feelings of the moment right here. I mean, I love the fact that Jesus doesn't seem to ask them why they're afraid. He doesn't even seem to have a problem with them being afraid. It's okay that you have these feelings. But he does emphasize, as the author of Mark puts out, that they were so afraid. Almost implying that there is a level of fear you can have, but when you have it too much, then it starts to cause issues. And they were all unified in that overwhelming fear that was a bit too much. And it was so much so that it gets them to ask the question, that's the whole purpose of the book of Mark. They ask, who is this? they all, in unison, having been overwhelmed with fear, now seeing what Jesus can do, in unison ask, "Who is this?" So, to conclude part one, just real quick, I want us to read responsibly this passage from Psalm 133. I think it should be up there, or it's in your in the handout as well. So let's read this together. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. Now let's take a minute as well in unity. Let's stand up, greet one another, pass the peace, say good morning to each other, pass the peace on with some handshakes and some high fives.